Well, howdy people, thanks for coming in again. Today I'm going to be doing a bread class, how to make bread, particularly for you guys who've never made bread before. It's a little bit intimidating aspect, so I'm going to walk through how to make it, what the steps are, and why, so you know what you're doing when you try to make your own bread. Bread's easy to make. All it is, flour and yeast and some water, and that's about it. Now, if you're just using flour, yeast, and water, it's not going to be a tasty bread. So we're going to add a little extra stuff. I'm going to be doing wheat with white, a mixture of the two flours, with some wheat bran and a little bit of honey. So it's like a honey wheat. But I'm going to go over all the components of this, and in particular, the critical steps to have a nice, fluffy, chewy bread instead of that lifeless lump that a lot of people make when they try and they get discouraged. So we're not going to be discouraged. What's the difference between store bread and homemade bread? Now, when you buy store bread, it's like a sponge. It's real fluffy and real soft. It lasts for 50 years sitting outside. Well, that's because store bread, unlike homemade bread, has a lot of preservatives, and it has these other chemicals, these emulsifiers and other chemicals in there, not just to preserve it, but to add extra air and make the dough airy and fluffy, so it's real spongy. And it kind of cheats you, because when you buy a loaf of bread, you're only getting 50% of product. Take a loaf of bread. If you want to do a side experiment with the kids, go buy yourself a loaf of cheap white bread and smush it down as much as you can. It'll be about that big, like the size of a tennis ball or so. So there's not a lot of ingredients into those store breads, but they're not made for nutrients or flavor. Some are, but the cheap ones and the shelf-ready, shelf-stable stuff is made for long-term storage. And of course, to make it profitable, you don't want to use so many ingredients. So you add these emulsifiers and make it really airy. So you're taking up volume, but you're replacing the components with air. So you're buying air. So we're going to make tasty homemade bread. Not a lot of air. Okay, going back to the three ingredients of bread, water, flour, and yeast, let's talk about yeast. What is yeast? So yeast is a living organism. It's a fungus. It's a type of fungus. There's yeast everywhere in the environment. So what your yeast is doing in the bread and why it makes it airy is it eats the sugars present in the carbohydrate. So it's digesting the sugars, and that fluffiness, when it rises, that's a carbohydrate, that's a byproduct. So it fills it with all these little teeny tiny air bubbles, and the longer it's in there eating, the heavier and the bigger this rise will get. At some point it stops, but that's what's causing the rise, is the living, see, he's active, he's doing his job, active yeast, eating up the sugars and producing that rise. But to have the rise go well, or have the bread turn out at all, you got to make sure your yeast is alive. So one of the things that you're encouraged to do is what they call proofing the yeast, or simply testing it. We're going to add our yeast, the amount we need for our ingredients for our bread recipe. We're going to add it to a bowl with a little bit of warm water and a pinch of sugar to activate it. And we're going to mix it up so the yeast can start digesting, and you can tell whether it's alive or not. For this recipe, I'm going to use a couple tablespoons of yeast. If you're doing with the little packets, which most people have, you might want to use two. 2 packets is plenty. If you add too much yeast, it's gonna change the flavor. You're gonna notice it different. Too little, it's obviously not gonna rise properly. Alongside the yeast, we're going to add sugar. A little bit of sugar to get these guys to have something to eat and start producing. And add your water. I'm doing about 2 cups. Well, that doesn't look very nice, does it? No. So we're going to mix it all up. Simply whisk the yeast and sugar together so the sugar dissolves and allows the yeast to have a small particulate to eat up and feel happy and multiply. After you've mixed it up, you give it about 5 minutes to proof, and you'll notice it'll get frothy, and you may even see some bubbles forming while you're looking at it. So that means your yeast is alive, and you can toss in all your dry ingredients and start mixing your bread batter. Cool, so our yeast is alive. So I'm gonna dip my honey, maybe a 1/4 cup or so. I never measure. And mix that honey in there. and get it prepped for the mixing machine. When you're making bread, it's not the recipe that matters, it's the technique. How do you knead the bread? Are you putting enough water in, too much water? Did you let the yeast sit for too long? So it's not the recipe. Like I said, bread is nothing but flour, water, and yeast. And then whatever you add after that, or whatever kind of ingredients you want to enhance your bread with. Plus there's some cooking techniques. But essentially in the basics, it's really the technique in how you knead your bread, your rising process, the heat, the temperature, and the room that you're even rising it is important. So pay attention to the technique. The ingredients, it don't matter so much. Now, when I'm prepping my dry ingredients, the flour, the sugars, I really like to run all those dry things through a sifter. Now, this is a hand sifter where you spin it and it'll get it through. And that's going to take out any chunks or any big pieces of flour that haven't broken up. You want to have a nice fine grain. And here we are with my big reflective bowl. Hi. We're going to put our dry ingredients in here. Like I said, we use our sifter. I love using this thing. It's fun. It's like a little toy for grown-ups. So let me add my flour. I'm going to put my white flour in first. So let's shift this thing up, shall we? Yeah, we make a little mess, so be careful. Let's do our wheat. Here's the wheat bran. That's the husk. That's the outside of that seed. It's good for you. Full of fiber. It's great for digestion, and there are nutrients in there. So you do want that in your bread. If you have it. It's not necessary, but it's great to put in there. It has a earthy flavor. It's really tasty, so I like the wheat bran in there. I'm going to do about a half a cup of sugar. You like. I like to have a little bit of sweetness. I don't really eat the bread. I feed it to the kids and wife. Salt. It's plenty. A little touch more. And now your bread is mixed. It's ready to go into the yeast proof. Let's make bread. When I mix my bread, I like to use a mixer. You can do this by hand, just a big heavy spoon in a bowl, but I like to use my mixer. Mixing with a mixer, you're going to use what's called a bread hook. Okay, you don't want to use a paddle. You see that? That's a paddle. Now the paddle bit will get totally clogged up with flour and water, and it'll just swirl and swirl and swirl around. It won't mix at all. So you want to stick with your bread hook if you're using a mixer, or a big heavy spoon if you're going to be doing it by hand. I'm going to dump most of my mixture into this bowl. And what's going to happen too is a lot of that bran and that wheat, it's going to absorb all that water. Attach my bread hook and flip her on. As this is mixing, you're going to want to scoop it off the sides, add some extra flour if you want to get the consistency right, and let the bread hook work it into the dough. And again, if you're using a spoon, you're going to be hand mixing. It's the same thing. I'm just extremely lazy, and this machine does the job for me. All right, cool. Not a very good lump of bread for putting in the oven, but it's the consistency I like coming out of here, because I'm still going to need some flour into this dough and make it loaf ready. It's not about the recipe, it's about the technique. So I'm going to take this goop out of that bowl and mix in some flour to get it to the right consistency for baking. I'm going to show you how I do that. It's a very easy kneading process. Oh, by the way, what's kneading? Kneading is where you're folding over the bread, rolling it out, folding it over. You're going to do it a few times until it has a consistency, stretchy texture. Let me show you. All right, people, first thing I'm going to do is sprinkle a little flour down on my work surface so it doesn't stick, because it loves to stick. I'm going to drag this out of here, get it down into this flour. Okay, so this loaf really isn't prepped. It's not ready. It's not good. If you see, it's not springing back. When this is done, it'll bounce back into shape. It doesn't want to have that gooey kind of style. I'm out of words today. Anyhow, so I'm going to take this flour and you're going to sprinkle it. Like I said, it's the technique. It's the method that you do this, not the ingredients. And we're going to just knead and knead until you get that consistency. I'm not going to need a lot of extra flour. I'm just going to need enough to get it to the consistency I want. This, I think, is sufficiently kneaded, and if you watch, you squish it, it'll come back into shape. Can you see that? I hope so. Anyway, she's springing back into shape. I'm going to toss this into the bowl and let it rise. I'll add a little flour to it to keep it from sticking. That's not going to affect it. It'll just keep it from sticking to the inside of the bowl. Toss it in. Now I'm going to let that rise for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to punch it down, knead it a couple more times, and get it ready for the oven. But why did I cover it up? So, new to bread people, why do you cover this bread when it's rising? The yeast wants to have the heat. You got to keep it warm, so that's going to keep the heat in it. And I put plastic wrap on top of it because, particularly in the winter time, house is going to be hotter and drier, and it's going to want to take the moisture out of that bread. So I keep it covered with plastic, especially in the fall and winter when it's drier in the house and the heat's on. But just give it about 45 minutes, and we'll come smoosh them down and turn them into bread loaves. And after that 45 minutes or so, look at this, huge! So we're going to take this out and smash it down for a second rise. Take your bread, roll her out. Smash this down again. We're going to do a second rise, but now we're going to form this into the loaves of bread. You only need to do this a few times. I'll do 5, maybe 10 folds, and until it has that nice consistency again. And there, you're about done. Now, if you notice, these pans are greased. I sprayed them with a little bit of grease. You could use butter, whatever, but I give them a spray with oil so when these cook, they pop out and they don't get stuck to the pan. You can also sprinkle a little flour, just dust it a little bit as well if you want, but this should be fine. Once the loaves are formed, cover them up, let them sit for about another 45 minutes, and then toss them in the oven. All right, so the second rise. Why do we beat the bread down to do a second rise? Why not stay with one? So the second rise, when you beat the bread down, you're tearing apart all the little holes that the the yeast formed when they were fermenting the sugar. So you're tearing those apart, you're squashing it down, you're letting more yeast form because these guys are multiplying in there. And the other thing that's really special about the yeast is they give bread the bread flavor, that rich, unique flavor that you get with yeast leavened breads. So we're going to let them multiply a little more, provide to that flavor. And actually that second rise, after you do a second kneading, it makes the bread more elastic and chewy, and the crumb of the bread is more elastic. So it makes a better, more consistent bread. You can do a single rise, but it ain't going to be so good. Not as good. We split the top so when it's cooking, it doesn't crack. Otherwise, you're going to get all this cracking because there's going to be stress as this thing continues to rise. This split will allow the bread to rise without cracking up your crust and making it hideous. So let's just give it a nice cut and add some water. I'm going to brush water over top of it. This is going to lock in a little moisture and make the crust crustier. And we'll sprinkle some flour on top to make it look like those classy flowers you see in the grocery store for $80 a loaf. See that? Look at that nice airy texture, nice and spongy. Just bounces right back. It's got a good crust. Well, it's good. You gotta try making your own bread. It's really damn good. Okay, folks, thanks for watching. That there bread's done. Now, once you take it out of the oven, let it sit for about 15 minutes or so. Let it cool down. It's still cooking. With that residual heat that's still inside there, it's still cooking. How are you looking? I hope this was beneficial to some of you. If so, let me know. If there's another food you want to know about, let me know that too. I'll see ya. Well, I guess that's that. So now we know how to make bread. It's very easy. Don't be afraid to try. Don't be intimidated by bread. It's just flour, water, and yeast. But when you're making good bread, you toss a little more extra stuff in there to give it some flavor. Please have fun making bread. Takes practice. It's the technique. You'll learn as you go. The first loaf you make may not be so good, but once you do it for a little while, they come out pretty fair. Any other food questions? Please feel free to ask. I cook constantly. I never get to stop. And then I clean. Thank you very much.